What a gift, Jackie. Thank you so much for that. Truly, the story is told, the song tells us, of the people who love the land. What must it have been like to be there on the day when 13 men, apostles to the teaching of white supremacy and certainly their own superiority, lay waste to what remained of the constitutional monarchy of the Kingdom of Hawaii? What must it have been like for the Queen later to stand trial in her own throne room, her own home, just downstairs from where she was imprisoned, and face charges that she was planning a violent response to the violent overthrow of her kingdom? What must it have been like for the Queen to spend a year and a half in Washington, D.C., lobbying everyone she could to prevent the annexation of her lost kingdom, and have no one help her to save her home? What must it have been like? Well, in part we know. The beautiful song Jackie offered to us this morning contains many of the feelings that the Hawaiian people had in response to annexation. Kaulana no Pua has many other names it goes by. One of my favorite names for the song is the Stone-Eating Song. It sort of gives a new twist to the stone soup from last week, doesn't it? Some say it got this name because of the haunting lyric that goes, "We are satisfied with the rocks of this land." That's the English translation as best it can be done. But it really comes from a story about the director of the Royal Hawaiian Band. For those of you who don't know, the director of the band, the role itself, is actually a political appointment. Every incoming mayor of Honolulu selects this person as part of their administration. And the director at the time of the overthrow required that all of the members of the band sign an oath to the provisional government. But instead, the entire band walked out. So the author of this song, Eleanor Kekoa Ohiwai Kalani Wright Pendergast, wrote the song for the band as an affirmation and praise for their fealty to the kingdom. The band leader, upon requiring the entire band to sign the oath of the provisional government, said something to them. He said that they better sign the oath or they'll be eating rocks. So I don't know enough about the story to say that Miss Pendergast knew that when she included the lyric, "We do not value the government's hills of money, we are satisfied with the rocks, the wondrous food of the land," but the idea of rocks themselves sustaining a people is a powerful and beautiful image, and a pretty awesome nickname for a song that came out as a kind of revolt to the band leader's comments. And this is the day, friends. January 17th, when the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy actually happened. And I tell you true, in all my years in church, and it's been a few, I don't mind saying, I never dreamed as a preacher I would be able to pull from current events, present day occurrences, to draw a comparison to something like the overthrow of a government, but here we are. What so many witnessed last week, the storming of a nation's capital, the sycophantic enabling of myths and lies by supposed leaders, and the resulting deaths on the grounds of a nation's capital are etched in the minds of many. A nation also watches intently as deliberations take place over what possible consequences might flow to one who hung so desperately to lies that stoked the insurrection we witnessed, etched and waiting. And so we also remember that etched into the collective conscious of these lands, etched into the very stones and etched into the memories of many, is an overthrow that utilized U.S. military force to achieve its ends and to wrest monarchical authority from Queen Liliuokalani and to place full control and authority for these lands into the 13 men who sought it so fiercely, so desperately, until when in 1959 these lands joined the United States of America, etched and waiting. And it was less than a month after statehood was approved that the state legislature, which used to meet where? In Iolani Palace, the one-time home of the deposed queen, it was there that the legislature received an honored guest to speak before them. I quote, "Mr. Speaker, distinguished members of the House of Representatives of this great new state in our union, ladies and gentlemen, it is certainly a delightful privilege and pleasure for me to have this great opportunity, and I shall say it is a great honor to come before you today and to have the privilege of saying just a few words to you about some of the pressing problems confronting our nation and our world." In case over the last few weeks you were wondering how someone with some class addresses a legislature, that's how. For this is how the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King addressed the Hawaii legislature on September 17, 1959. The legislature convened in Iolani Palace downstairs from where the Queen was imprisoned in the past. Dr. King had recently addressed the National Baptist Convention and had spoken in a few places in Los Angeles, and he arrived here in Hawaii for what else? Some vacation, but also to meet some engagements for speaking, including at our legislature. The speech to the legislature was not long. His initial address to the body, citing what he sees as special about Hawaii, certainly would warm the heart of those who hold Hawaii out as an example to others. His words, "I come to you with a great deal of appreciation and great feeling of appreciation, I should say, for what has been accomplished in this beautiful setting and in this beautiful state of our union. As I think of the struggle that we are engaged in the Southland, we look to you for inspiration and as a noble example where you have already accomplished in this area of racial harmony and racial justice what we are struggling to accomplish in other sections of the country, and you can never know what it means to those of us caught for the moment in the tragic and often dark midnight of man's inhumanity to man to come to a place where we see the glowing daybreak of freedom and dignity and racial justice." Now, man, he can write. It's only fair to remember that in 1959, Hawaii sent to Washington the first Asian American senator in history in the person of Hiram L. Fong. And the coexistence and co-leadership of some, and I stress some, of the legislators in Hawaii at that time might certainly have appeared to any observer to be a testament to racial harmony. But many of us know that the treatment of the Hawaiian people for a century by that time had all but entirely dispossessed those to whom this land was home long before any others arrived. And to hear these words in the very building that imprisoned the Queen must have been hard on some who knew this history. And let's also recall the time in history when King was speaking here in Hawaii. It was 1959. The landmark anti-segregation case, Brown versus Board of Education, had been decided only 5 years earlier. That was when 17 states and the District of Columbia were ordered to desegregate their schools in that decision. So how was it going 5 years on there in 1959? In King's words, most of these states have complied with the decision, and just 5 states are left that have not made any move in the area of compliance, and 2 of these states are now under orders to integrate: Atlanta, Georgia, and New Orleans, Louisiana. So, it was going a little slowly, friends, as optimistic as he sounded. Also, the historic raft of landmark civil rights legislation had not even been signed into law yet in 60, 64, and 68. But this is the optimism Dr. King had for the struggle he was facing. To see the progress where there was progress while acknowledging how far he had to go. His entire speech, which I do commend to you, it is not hard to find online, speaks first of optimism and pessimism. He explains the presence of exceeding optimism in some that says, nothing will ever change, so why do anything? That is not the kind of talk we hear around this community much, I know, but I know in the back of some minds that idea, why do anything, comes up sometimes. That thought might even have crossed a mind or two when watching the events unfold at the U.S. Capitol. But Dr. King cites something equally dangerous, exceeding optimism. He speaks of the person who looks around, sees so much progress over where we are or the accomplishment of one or maybe a few goals, and then sits back, arms folded, and says, we're all good. Bigotry and racism, that's solved. I'm paraphrasing here. More insidious to Dr. King than pessimism was the false sense of accomplishment and change in exceeding optimism. In fact, he says those two things are equally useless sides of a dangerous coin. Instead, Dr. King proposes being a realist. He describes a realistic attitude like this. The realistic attitude seeks to reconcile the truths of two opposites while avoiding the extremes of both. So the realist in the area of race relations would agree with the optimist that we have come a long, long way, but he would balance that by agreeing with the pessimist that we have a long, long way to go. And so this is my answer to the question of whether there has been any progress in the area of race relations. I seek to be realistic and say we have a long, long way to go. This is sound advice and prophetic. In the past 2 weeks, I have heard impassioned friends who mostly are in the center of politics and social issues, who have rested, frankly, on the sidelines in many ways for some of the last few years of political and social life, start to come alive again. One friend called to say that he hasn't been on Facebook in years. Uh-oh. And now he is having calls every day with people who have differing views about what this nation, this experiment in democratic rule is facing and will still be facing for the months and the years ahead. And he is a rarer and rarer breed, a realist who is not so convinced that nothing can be done and is sure that we're not done. And we know, all of us here, there is work to be done. Many of us are hearing from people who come from a center, a place between political polar opposites that I don't think, I wasn't sure even existed anymore if you watch the news or are on any social media. These centrists, often staying out of the fray, are now raising voices in the face of what they now see as a real threat, not just to the idea of democratic rule, but to the home they love. They are seeing finally what Dr. King knew to be so true in 1959. The ghosts of the past are never really gone. In his address, he evoked this powerful image, his words. Figuratively speaking, that old man's segregation is on his deathbed, but you know that history has proven that social systems have a great last-minute breathing power, and the guardians of the status quo are always on hand with the oxygen tents to keep the old order alive, and this is exactly what we see today. In case anyone wonders why Dr. King is so regularly hailed as a prophet, that chill you're feeling in your bones right now, at the truth of more than half a century later that comes from his words, that's why. He goes on. But if democracy is to live, segregation must die. Segregation is a cancer in the body politic which must be removed before our democratic health can be realized. In a real sense, the shape of the world today does not permit us the luxury of an anemic democracy. If we are to survive, if we are to stand as a force in the world, if we are to maintain our prestige, we must solve this problem because people are looking over to America. And Dr. King's words are perhaps never truer than today. We are in a month when we are looking at brokenness together, friends, here at this church, and systems across a nation are still rife with real segregation. The epidemic of mass incarceration keeps black and brown bodies segregated from society at a massively higher rate than white bodies, and especially so for Hawaiian people here in Hawaii. 60% of the population are people of Hawaiian ancestry. The impact of the COVID pandemic on frontline workers who were largely persons, and in particular women of color, is affecting communities of color disproportionately. And just today, a new report declares that persons of color, are being vaccinated for the virus at a disproportionately lower rate. The list goes on. And this is not the only kind of segregation we know today. There is not a lot more broken than the way we are trying to communicate across divides in a nation today. What I see as self-imposed, self-constructed, self-affirming kinds of segregation is at work in our civil society. There are places now where some people with certain beliefs simply will not go. I know people who have sworn never to set foot in Florida again. I do not blame you. I have another friend, though, a close friend from college, who's moving to Florida, literally leaving New York because he feels he's being prevented from ever expressing his basic conservative values. Speaking about anything with people we disagree with is getting harder. People are literally moving states over it. They are finding new homes, and I get it. When someone can believe and hold to something demonstrably false and fictitious as both true and grounds for armed insurrection, well, there just isn't much we can say to that person, right? I get it. I really do. But the segregation between polar opposite worldviews is eroding any room for a middle ground of understanding. And it is physically remaking the home many of us know and share. Today, we welcomed 7 people into our community. And I strongly believe that the powerful witness of our community that not only speaks to a wider world, but also focuses clearly on the needs of our close community, what we share with one another here on this island. I believe that is part of the way we are reaching more and more people. Dr. King's opening remarks spoken here in these lands, here in this home, ring so true for so many who come here every week to be with us, who join us in the work we're doing. His words: "You can never know what it means to those of us caught in the moment in this tragic and often dark midnight of man's inhumanity to man, to come to a place where we see the glowing daybreak of freedom and dignity and racial justice." In other words, to come to a place building the beloved community. Which you may not know it, friends, but that is what we are doing in this spiritual home. You know, hundreds of people attended and hundreds more watched the replay of a presentation I was honored to give at the invitation of Paula Cole-Jones about what it is like to minister in a congregation that undertakes the hard work of building the beloved community, guided by the 8th principle of Unitarian Universalism adopted by this congregation. Hundreds of people, friends. Yeah, we are doing the work, and people are starting to take notice. Dr. King spoke at length about building the beloved community throughout his entire life. It was one of his aims, one of his goals, and I hear people all the time ask, well, what is the beloved community? In another address, Dr. King describes it as this: the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposers into friends. It is this type of understanding goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men. And we might today add in the hearts of all humans. But that is the beloved community. Opposers into friends, the lows into the great joys. Dr. King was asked following his visit to Hawaii to reflect on what he saw and what he learned there. He said this to a local newspaper: "As I looked at all of these various faces and various colors mingled together like the waters of the sea, I could see only one face, the face of the future." And friends, the future is here now. The words of Dr. King, prophetic as they are, ache to be fulfilled, yearn to see culmination, leap from our chests with hope for a nation. But words on paper, thoughts in our head, and arms folded across the silent chest aren't worth much, the land tells us. For it would be better to take action and eat the rocks of one's home than to be satisfied with mere words on paper and so much idle verbiage. Dr. King knew deeply in his own mortality. It called to him across threatening phone lines. It yelled from the bombs thrown into churches and in his home, and it threatened the mobs, right from the mouths of the mobs, of those polarized against his revolutionary message of the beloved community. And yet, in the faces of this place, he saw the future more clearly than he'd ever seen it before. And so I wonder about a man whose favorite hymn, and the hymn sung at his funeral, a hymn that implores, "Lead me home." So I wonder about a queen deposed by insurrection who spends more than a year in a foreign land capital trying to save her people, who, homesick, might ask and implore, "Lead me home." And so I wonder about a church and her people who see so much of pain and division while praying for so much unity, who when the day is darkest keeps working, while wondering when the daybreak of justice will warm these lands once again, who long to be at the river together to build the beloved community, while the very banks of that river seem content to tear that river asunder. And for that church, to that home, I say this: lead me by the still waters of compassion in this shared and yet broken land. Lead me by the light of the breaking dawn of justice in this powerful yet healing land. Lead me by the unbridled joy in this troubled yet sacred land. Lead me to compassion. Lead me to justice. Lead me to joy. Lead me to what is etched in the stone at the head of the man who began to build the beloved community, free at last. But in the end, after the long, long day, most of all, friends, lead me home. So sing it with me now.